are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview retired U.S. Navy Commander Tina Erwin. Commander Erwin is the author of multiple spiritual books, and in this episode, we talk about how print on demand has been a big game changer for self-published authors. I'm here with the retired U.S. Navy Commander Tina Erwin, who has written several spiritual books. Commander Erwin, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
I worked for the Navy. I specifically worked for the submarine force for 20 years. My claim to fame was I designed equipment that protected submarines from terrorist attack. Along the way, I discovered that I was pretty psychic, and although that was not used in the Navy, when I retired, it seemed like all directions were pointing in following a far more spiritual path. The military is a path of service, and I just sort of elevated it to a more spiritual service because psychic ability is a responsibility. It's not a gift. It's not like you can return it.
Now, how big of an adjustment was it for you to go from being a submarine commander who helped protect submarines from terrorist attacks to writing spiritual books?
Well, I never commanded a submarine. I want to be very clear about that. I worked for the submarine force, but women were not allowed to serve on submarines until the last several years. So I've been retired quite a while.
Okay, I apologize for the incorrect implication. Your rank was commander in the Navy, and
Correct.
You worked on the submarine force, but you were not a submarine commander.
I was not, and I have such respect for the men that I worked with who were submarine commanders that I want to make sure I'm crystal clear about that. So to get back to your question, what was the transition? What I would say is that when you're helping other people, it doesn't matter whether you wear a military uniform or jeans and a t-shirt. If you're helping another person, you're helping another person. And whether you're fighting terrorism in the physical world or the darkness of a black magician in the spiritual world, at the end of the day, it's pretty much all the same. Evil that hurts other people is still evil, no matter what dimension you're in.
How did your service in the Navy prepare you for writing spiritual books?
Service in the Navy prepares you for this particular task because what you see is how what you do comes back to you. One of the easiest examples is your military reputation. So it's karma in action, and I've written 3 books, theme and variation, about karma. And so if you establish a reputation that you are good with your crew, that you are fair, that you're honest, that you will go to the mat for your crew members, no matter what your job is, then that follows you from place to place. That's karma in action. The element of ghosts was very prevalent in the Navy because we spent 3 years living in Naples, Italy. And we were stationed in buildings. I was particularly stationed in buildings that were built by the Nazis in World War II. And you could hear the ghosts in the building. We think people, there was an office above the office I had, and people were tortured in that office. You could hear them at night if you had the duty. And there were several officers I served with who were also psychic and could hear them. I had crew members who never in their wildest dreams considered themselves psychic that were terrified to be in that building at night. It's not whether or not it's military or civilian, or you're an adult or a child. These things happen to people no matter where you are or what your job is. You encounter them. I had a crew member, I had this terrible feeling someone had died, and I was, serving in Italy. And I was the admin officer for Naval Communication Area Master Station Mediterranean in Naples. And I had this terrible feeling somebody died, and it was just literally driving me crazy. I could just feel this ghost with me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Was it somebody I knew? And finally, 2 days later, I got an American Red Cross message in that the grandfather of one of my crew members had died. And it was my job to sit him down and gently break the news that his grandfather had died. And I realize as I'm telling this young man as gently as I can that his grandfather has passed away, and his grandfather raised him, so it was very emotional, and I could feel his grandfather next to me, and then I realized that's who was there. It wasn't harmful, he wasn't trying to hurt me, but he was really sad to be leaving his grandson, and I could feel that. So throughout my career, those things happened. And when we left Italy, we moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and good God, everything in Charleston is haunted. So we moved into a profoundly haunted house, although the house itself was 18 months old. The property was haunted. And I wrote three books in a series called Ghost Stories from the Ghost Point of View, and the very first story in the very first book is what it was like to live in an extremely haunted house for 7 years and then discover that the entire neighborhood was haunted. And that really started me on the path of trying to figure out, what do you do with a ghost? Why doesn't anybody know how to, quote, remove them, get rid of them, or cross them over? And that it became sort of the subroutine in my brain that said, you have got to figure this out. I don't care what your job is. This is going to be really big for you.
Now, without spoiling too much about each of your books, what are each of your books about? And I understand you have about 8 of them, so if you have to take a long time to answer this question, that's okay.
I wrote The Lightworker's Guide to Healing Grief in 2000. It was purchased in 2008 by the Edgar Cayce Center in Virginia Beach. They were my first publisher. Everything else I published myself. And that's because my 6-year-old niece sat on the sofa next to her mom and said, "Gee, Mommy, I feel hot." And she died right in front of my sister. And I was helping my sister and her family with this profound grief of losing a 6-year-old to Group A strep. I realized that everyone was grieving something. Everyone told us about someone they loved who died. It was astounding. So even though we were all grieving, I'm still observing what is happening to the human beings around me. How are they responding to us? So that book is designed to help you if you're grieving. It's also a tool book. If you have to help your neighbor whose husband committed suicide, what do you say? So this is a tool book for helping anyone who's grieving anything, whether it's a divorce, loss of job, house fire. It explains what spiritual service is on the most down-to-earth level and how you can help yourself. And that book is about to become an audiobook. Literally should be released any minute. I'm waiting for ACX for the final release on that. The second book was The Lightworker's Guide to Everyday Karma, because people think karma is some, Far Eastern concept. But karma is every day. And I'll give you an example. My oldest son is a mechanic. He was a master mechanic for BMW and for Rolls-Royce. I mean, he is really, really a super fine mechanic. And he talked about the karma. He didn't call it karma, but the cause and effect of what you do with your car. If you keep your car clean inside and out, and you love your car, I mean, it's an emotional thing, but metal carries energy. And if you say, "Oh, I just love this car," your car will have far fewer repairs. So we were discussing the karma. I had a great time discussing the mechanics of things, air pressure, tire. Pay attention to your car. That karma comes back to you in fewer car repairs. But I also talked about a whole host of other things, whether it's past lives, that relate to everyday karma and how you can wrap your brain around it. That's what that book's about. The next 3 are I listened to thousands of ghosts tell me what happened to them, how they died. They died in a plane crash. They died on the battlefield. They died in Cornwallis's army. They were slaves. They were slave owners. They were settlers. They were Native Americans. They were children. All these people told me what happened after they died. So the next 3 books are ghost stories from the ghost's point of view. What is it like to be 7 years old and not have any idea that you died? The world you live in never changes. So that's what those books are about. The last of the series has a great deal of what happened to me personally, from horrendous premonitions to possession to actually solving a human trafficking situation which was kind of an amazing event. The next book was Karma and Frequency, which explains how the frequency you maintain as a person directly relates to your karma. It's like if you bathe every day, you have a lower infection probability. If you wash your hands before you work with food, you keep contamination down. Cause and effect. And this one actually discusses the specific frequency tools you need to keep your karma at a higher level. The next book was Soul Evolution, Past Lives and Karmic Ties. So this is the 7th book. And this book explains how your karma from past lives moves forward with you into future lives. And what can you do about it if you feel like maybe, in the past you weren't, so keen on things. But this life, you want to make it different. You want to have a different experience. That's what Soul Evolution is. And it's been a really good book. Almost all of these are audiobooks. I think I have 3 left to really work with. The 8th book is called the Crossing Over Prayer Book, because I did figure out how to cross over the dead. And once I figured it out, I'm moving thousands upon thousands of people on. I mean, they don't come to you one at a time. You'll have clouds. It's like these energy hits you like a wall, and it's completely debilitating if you don't know how to help them. So I created something called the Crossing Over Prayer. And then people all over the world started to write to me and say, do you have a crossing over prayer for suicide? Or my child was murdered? Or should I cross over the murderer of my child? I crossed over my child using the crossing over prayer for murder victims, but I'm so angry at the murderer. So there's a crossing over prayer for murderers and suicide and for families and for first responders. And so it's 88 prayers to help the living and the dead. And that is been a very popular audiobook, because if you are in a graveyard, if you're in a hospital and you have a psychic child and the ghosts come at you or this child like this horde, start playing that prayer and they will leave you alone, and you will be doing spiritual service. So I have several more that I'm writing right now. I'm finishing up some audiobooks, and so yeah, it's been quite a journey.
Now, you mentioned briefly that you had a small publisher publish your first book, but you asked for the rights back after the printing run was over. Now, did you get your rights back, and how easy or difficult was that?
My first book, The Lightworker's Guide to Healing Grief, was published by the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, way at the beach in Virginia Beach, Virginia. They're a small publisher and have very narrow criteria, which I met. I mean, within 24 hours, they offered me a contract. So it was a very good book as far as they were concerned. But they only print 2,000 copies. And this was before Amazon did print on demand. Once the 2,000 copies are sold, the book is taken off the market, period. I mean, no more. And I'm thinking, I want this on Amazon. I want it on Kindle, and I want an audiobook. And so as the run finished, I had a very good relationship with this publisher. I still do. And I said, I want my rights back. And they said, in the history of the Edgar Cayce Center, we've never had anyone ask for their rights back. And I said, well, no guts, no glory. So I asked for my rights back, and I have a very clear letter from the publisher handing me back all rights in all formats, digital and print and audio. And that was the last time I used a publisher. I publish everything myself now.
Yeah, in your case, going through a small publisher, I mean, technology outpaced what this publisher was really capable of doing. And print on demand has been a huge game changer for the self-publishing world.
Oh my God, it's incredible. No longer do you have to have a garage full of books that you hope to heaven you can sell. I mean, I might have one extra copy of all my books, but people just go on Amazon and have it delivered to their door.
Yeah, because my garage is quite full with my mom's car and various lawn and garden tools. I really wouldn't have room in my garage to store hundreds of copies of a book. So print on demand, I probably wouldn't be able to even consider writing books if it wasn't for print on demand.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I love print on demand. And in fact, there's a very interesting story of a guy who was doing a podcast with a really, really like Bloomberg or something. It was huge, huge company, huge visual, and he had a publisher, and they only printed the book. And several of us kept saying, "Dude, you really need to do print on demand with Amazon." So the publisher had print books with Amazon, but he didn't have anything on Kindle, and his book sold out on Amazon in the first 5 minutes, and people buy on impulse. And he lost thousands of dollars in sales because he didn't have a print on demand book.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to move on to the next question here. That's a very good illustration of how print on demand is a lifesaver for authors who want to consider that, because if your book doesn't sell well, you don't have hundreds or thousands of copies of the book lying around taking space, whatever. And if your book sells well, there's plenty of copies to be printed.
Exactly.
Now, if you have a typical writing routine, what is your typical writing routine like?
I love writing. I'm not the person who has writer's block. That's never happened to me. I get my work, all the correspondences out of the way in the morning, and then the afternoon, it's like everybody leaves me alone, and I can dive into it, and I have a very organized process, and I have the contents on one side and what I'm writing on the other. And as I'm writing, more information will come. Well, you need to branch off into this topic and keep it logical. So it's like having two screens going on at the same time. I have a huge, huge iMac. And that enables me to go back and look at it and look at it and look at it and massage it. And when I'm editing it myself, I read it out loud. How does this sound? Does this make any sense? And then I have other people who are not professional editors, but who look at it from the point of view, well, does this make any sense? Because my level of understanding spirituality may not be someone who's never, new to the process. So it has to bridge a lot of knowledge levels. So to be able to sit and write is incredible. I write on airplanes, I write in airports. It's my happy place.
Now, are you planning on or considering writing more books?
I have 3 major books left to write, yes. Huge, huge books.
And to recap, because I think you defined karma a little bit earlier in this podcast episode. For those of you who for those of our listeners who might have glossed over that for whatever reason, a lot of people I follow on social media, if they're my generation or younger, I'm a millennial who was born to parents in the boomer generation, so I tend to speak like someone who's a generation or two older. But a lot of people I follow on social media use the word karma as a regular part of their vocabulary, and I honestly think some of them are, I'm not going to name names, I think some of them are maybe using the word in incorrect usage. And how do you define karma?
Well, it's a law of physics, and physics isn't something you can just gloss over. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, is just a law of physics. And if you want the Sanskrit name for it, that word is karma, but it's action and reaction. And every breath you take, every move you make, everything you do creates a reaction. It echoes out. And the higher level you are, the more influence you have over other people, the greater is the level of reaction that comes back to you through time. Karma, your karmic clock doesn't end when you die. It continues. It's one of the reasons you want to cross over a ghost, because that karmic clock continues until you cross over into the heaven world, and then that clock stops. And the records of all that you did in that most recent life is added to your karmic savings and loan, your checks and balances. So I mean, I can go into a greater explanation, but that's sort of the gist of it.
Yeah, your explanation about was it Newton's third law of physics, action and reaction? Was that Newton's second or third law? I don't remember which.
Um,
It was one of Newton's laws of physics. I just don't remember exactly which one.
I don't remember which one it was. The second law of thermodynamics is energy is neither created nor destroyed, which explains ghosts. Whatever it was, whichever thermodynamic or Newton's law, also applies to quantum physics as well. So you can, for every action you take, there's going to be a corresponding reaction. And I mean, we certainly see that in social media. We see that with the easiest way to describe it is when somebody has a 2-year-old and they never want to corral that 2-year-old. Well, the action you don't take when they're 2 will come back to haunt you when they're 22 and you have no influence over them and they're a nightmare. But when you start putting in controls and discipline, it can be gentle, but no, don't put your finger in that light socket. You can say no to a child in a gentle way without being cruel, but you have to learn, that child must learn limits, and tantrums are actually pretty easy to handle. And you learn you teach the child self-discipline, and that learning will put that child in an amazing place when they're a teenager and a young adult. It comes back to you really quickly.
Oh yeah, an expression I'll sometimes use is play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Well, that's certainly true. If you play mental games, what happens is people don't want to play that game anymore. And it's like, are you trying to convince you or me how smart you are? I mean, if you know who you are, why do you need to prove it all the time?
Well, Commander Erwin, I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and you have a great evening.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
I thank Commander Erwin for her service to America, and once again, I apologize for incorrectly referring to her as a submarine commander during the interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.